October 15, 1961. Hitsville, USA, Studio A. The clock read 7:43 p.m., and the air inside the small recording booth had grown thick with cigarette smoke and frustration. Marvin Gaye sat behind his drum kit, sticks resting on his knees, watching Berry Gordy pace back and forth like a caged animal. For the fourth time that evening, Mary Wells had tried to nail the vocal for "The One Who Really Loves You," and for the fourth time, her voice had cracked on the bridge. Barry stopped pacing and looked at the young woman in the vocal booth. "Mary, honey, your throat's shot. We need to call it." Marvin's fingers tightened around his drumsticks. He had been sitting in that same spot for 6 hours, keeping time for takes that never made it to the end. But something else had been happening during those 6 hours. While everyone focused on Mary's failing voice, Marvin had been learning the song. Not just the rhythm parts he was paid to play, but every melody line, every harmony, every breath between the notes. He knew he could sing it. The certainty sat in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. "Pack it up, everybody," Barry announced to the room. "We'll try again tomorrow." The session musicians began unplugging their instruments. Smokey Robinson gathered his sheet music with visible annoyance. Earl Van Dyke closed the piano lid with more force than necessary. Another night, another incomplete recording. In the competitive world of 1961, Detroit R&B, incomplete recordings meant lost opportunities, and lost opportunities meant other labels would fill the void. But Marvin didn't move from his drum stool. He sat there staring at the empty microphone in the vocal booth, that weight in his chest growing heavier. 3 months earlier, Harvey Fuqua had walked him through these same doors with a simple introduction. "Barry, meet Marvin. Best session drummer I know." That was it. No mention of the songs Marvin had written for the Moonglows. No mention of the lead vocals he'd sung on their smaller releases. No mention of the nights Marvin had stayed up until dawn, perfecting harmonies that would never see the light of day. Harvey had his reasons for the omission. At Anna Records, Marvin had been difficult to manage, too eager to contribute ideas, too quick to question arrangements. Harvey needed someone reliable for the Motown transition, not another aspiring star with opinions. Marvin had accepted the reduction in status because he needed the work. The transition from Harvey's Anna Records to Barry's Motown meant steady pay, even if it meant sitting in the background while other people became stars. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was learning the business from the inside. But those 3 months had been harder than he'd expected. Every morning, he'd walked into Hitsville knowing he had more to offer than anyone realized. Every evening, he'd walked out having contributed nothing but steady timing and reliable silence. The worst part wasn't the invisibility itself. It was watching other singers struggle with songs he knew he could handle better. He'd seen promising tracks ruined by performers who couldn't find the emotional center of the material. He'd watched Barry grow frustrated with artists who had the technical skill but lacked the instinctive understanding. During breaks between sessions, while other musicians went outside to smoke or grab coffee, Marvin would stay at his drums, quietly working through vocal arrangements in his head. He'd imagine how he would phrase certain lines, where he would add breath, where he would push the emotion harder. But temporary had stretched into 3 months of watching, waiting, and keeping his mouth shut. 3 months of arriving early and staying late, observing how Barry crafted hits, how Smokey wrote hooks, how the magic happened in that cramped studio on West Grand Boulevard. 3 months of perfect timing, flawless rhythm work, and complete invisibility. The other musicians had started to see him as part of the furniture. Reliable Marvin, quiet Marvin, the drummer who never complained, never missed a beat, never caused problems. They liked him precisely because he made their lives easier by demanding nothing for himself. "You coming, Marvin?" Earl Van Dyke called from the doorway. "Yeah, just give me a minute." Earl shrugged and left. One by one, the others filed out until only Marvin and Barry remained in the studio. Barry was shuffling through papers at the control board, muttering about tomorrow's schedule. He seemed to have forgotten Marvin was still there. Marvin stood up from his drum stool. His legs felt unsteady, not from fatigue, but from the realization that this moment had been building for 3 months. Every night he'd gone home to his small apartment, he'd replayed the day's sessions in his mind. Every morning he'd woken up with melodies in his head that he never shared. Every week that passed, the weight in his chest had grown heavier. Barry. Barry looked up from his papers, surprised. Oh, Marvin. Thought you left already. Good work tonight, as always. I want to try something. Barry's expression shifted from casual friendliness to mild confusion. Try what? Marvin nodded toward the vocal booth. The song. I want to try singing it. The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an hour to Marvin. He watched Barry's face process the request, saw the automatic no forming, then saw it pause as Barry really looked at him for perhaps the first time since they'd been introduced. You sing? Barry asked. I used to, with Harvey's group. Harvey never mentioned that. Harvey had other priorities. Barry leaned back in his chair, studying Marvin with the calculating gaze that had built Motown from nothing into Detroit's most promising independent label. Everything about Barry's success had come from recognizing talent before anyone else did. He'd heard something in the Miracles that other labels missed. He'd seen potential in the Supremes when they were still struggling teenagers from the projects. But he'd also learned to be suspicious of session musicians who harbored star ambitions. In 3 months, Barry had formed a clear impression of Marvin Gaye. Reliable, professional, unambitious. The kind of musician who made everyone else's job easier by never complicating the process. Barry respected that quality, even if he didn't find it particularly interesting. But something in his voice tonight had been different. All right, Barry said finally, but just once. I don't have time to stroke egos tonight. Marvin walked to the vocal booth on unsteady legs. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone stand. Through the glass, he could see Barry settling back into his chair with the weary expression of a man humoring a child. This was it. The moment that would either validate 3 months of silent observation or confirm his place as background support for other people's dreams. He put on the headphones and heard his own breathing, amplified and suddenly too loud. The instrumental track began, and for the first 4 bars, Marvin just listened, feeling the familiar rhythm he'd played dozens of times that evening. Then he opened his mouth and began to sing. The first verse came out tentatively, almost conversational. He was feeling his way into the song, testing his voice against the arrangement, making sure everything fit. Through the glass, he could see Barry's expression hadn't changed, still waiting to be impressed, still skeptical. But something was happening inside Marvin's chest. The weight that had been sitting there for 3 months was shifting, transforming into something else. Every word he sang felt like a small confession. Every note a piece of himself he'd been hiding. The melody felt like something he'd been carrying his whole life, waiting for the right moment to release it. As he sang, memories flooded through him. His father's disapproval of his musical ambitions. The years of singing in church, feeling the power of his voice but never being allowed to use it fully. The nights at Anna Records when Harvey would give the lead vocals to other singers while Marvin provided background harmony. When the chorus arrived, his voice opened up completely. Not the polished professional sound of the established Motown stars, but something rawer, more vulnerable. There was pain in it, yes, but also hope. There was longing, but also determination. Each word carried the weight of 3 months of silence. Barry straightened in his chair. Through the glass, Marvin could see the change in his posture, the way he leaned forward slightly. But Marvin couldn't stop now, couldn't let himself be distracted by Barry's reaction. The second verse found Marvin settling deeper into the song, his voice gaining confidence with each line. He began to add small embellishments, tiny variations that made the familiar melody feel completely fresh. His left hand moved unconsciously, conducting an invisible orchestra, while his right hand gripped the microphone stand. He thought about Mary Wells struggling with this same song just hours earlier. Her voice had been technically superior, more trained, more polished, but she hadn't been able to find the heart of the song. Marvin found that place instinctively, not through technique but through recognition. By the time the bridge arrived, the transformation was complete. The quiet session drummer had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone Barry had never seen before. Marvin's voice soared into a falsetto that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his physical body, then dropped back down to a rich baritone that wrapped around the lyrics like velvet. When the song ended, the studio fell silent except for the soft hiss of the recording equipment. Marvin kept his eyes closed for a moment, not wanting to see disappointment in Barry's face. not ready to return to reality. Jesus Christ, Barry whispered. Marvin opened his eyes. Through the glass, he could see Barry staring at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not the polite interest Barry showed to hopeful artists, not the calculated assessment he gave to potential signings. Something closer to shock. "Where the hell did that come from?" Barry asked through the talkback system. Marvin removed his headphones with shaking hands. "It's been there the whole time." Barry stood up and walked into the vocal booth, moving like a man in a daze. He stood directly in front of Marvin, studying his face as if seeing it for the first time. "Harvey told me you were a drummer." "Harvey saw what he needed to see. And you've been sitting back there for 3 months saying nothing?" Marvin nodded. "I was learning, watching, waiting for the right moment. And tonight was the right moment? Tonight I couldn't wait anymore." Barry was quiet for a long time, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. In the world of early 1960s R&B, discovering a new talent wasn't just about finding a good voice. It was about finding someone who could carry the emotional weight of the music, who could make people believe in the stories being told. What Barry had just heard wasn't technically perfect. Marvin's voice still needed training, still needed the polish that would come with experience. But the essential ingredient was there. The ability to transform pain into beauty, to make vulnerability sound like strength. "Can you do it again?" Barry asked. This time, when Marvin sang, Barry recorded it. The tape that was made that night would become the foundation for Marvin Gaye's first solo contract with Motown. Barry spent the next week playing the recording for other executives, for Smokey Robinson, for anyone whose opinion mattered. Each person who heard it had the same reaction: shock, followed by recognition, followed by the question of how they'd missed this talent for 3 months. The other session musicians had mixed reactions to Marvin's sudden elevation. Some were genuinely happy for him. Others felt envious, as if Marvin had been playing a game they didn't know existed. Within 6 months, Marvin would release "Let Your Conscience Be Your Guide," his debut single. Within a year, he would be touring as a headliner. But success, when it came, felt different than Marvin had imagined. The recognition he'd craved turned out to carry its own weight, its own complications. The spotlight that had seemed so appealing from behind the drums became a pressure he wasn't fully prepared for. More troubling was the way success changed his relationship with music itself. During those months as a session player, music had been pure desire, the thing he wanted most but couldn't have. Once he had it, the simplicity of that desire became complicated by expectations, by business considerations. The quiet session drummer who had grabbed the microphone that October night had wanted nothing more than the chance to sing. He'd achieved that goal entirely, but achieving it meant discovering that being heard was only the beginning of a much longer, more complex journey. Sometimes in his dressing room after concerts in later years, when the applause had faded and the crowds had gone home, Marvin would remember the purity of that moment in the Studio A. The absolute pure clarity of wanting something simple, to be allowed to use his voice. Before the complications of fame and success, before the weight of expectations, before the realization that being heard meant never being able to disappear again. That night in 1961, he had stepped forward and claimed his voice. Everything that followed, both the triumph and the eventual tragedy that would consume him, grew from that defining moment of courage. The transformation was completely and utterly irreversible.